Right, last week we looked at why study the Old Testament and concluded that actually if it was what Jesus taught from, then it's a pretty good thing to study. We looked at the why study prophecy, and we know that Jesus upbraided the Pharisees and the Sadducees for not having studied prophecy and therefore missing out on things that they should have recognized. And in particular, we know that they missed out on the arrival of their Messiah. When he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, they should have recognized who he was. Because they didn't understand prophecy, they missed that. And because of that, Jerusalem then was destroyed in 70 AD. We looked too at what prophecy is and said that as far as the Western mind's concerned, prophecy is usually a statement and its fulfillment. But that's not the way the Hebrews look at it. The Jewish mindset is that you have patterns and types and hidden things, and they can all be prophetic. So we're going to look at some of those later. What is the significance of the fact that prophecies have been fulfilled so exactly and precisely? Well, it really shows that God's word is true, doesn't it? If he can speak something and hundreds of years later it comes to being exactly as he said, then we can trust the rest of it. And then we looked at probability, because some people say, well, these things, they've just happened by coincidence, you know, that somebody prophesies something and you can interpret it different ways, and it's just a coincidence. And we looked, I think, at about 48 of the prophecies of Jesus's birth and his life and ministry, and looking at just 8 meant that it was an astronomical probability that these things should have happened by accident. And we looked at direct prophecies of Jesus's birth and ministry. So now we're going to go on to look at some other things. The prophecies fulfilled at the time of his death. A whole lot of prophecies fulfilled on one day in a 24-hour period. So we're going to look at prophecies of his betrayal, trial, death, and burial. And they're particularly validated by the fact that they're prophecies by lots of different people over a period of 5 centuries. And they were all fulfilled in this 24-hour period. So many different people over hundreds of years, and yet they're all fulfilled just within 24 hours. That's pretty remarkable. To start with, I just want to talk about crucifixion a little bit, because crucifixion was invented by the Persians in the 6th century BC. So at the time when David wrote the psalm that we're going to look at, it wasn't even invented. It was 400 years before crucifixion was invented. The Jewish capital punishment was by stoning. And therefore, if the Jews had had the right to put him to death, which had actually been removed from them in 11 AD, if they'd had the right to do it, Jesus wouldn't have been crucified. He'd have been stoned to death. But because the Romans' method of killing people was crucifixion, that was what happened. And that had been prophesied very precisely about 600 years before. So in Jewish law, then capital punishment was by stoning. The Romans did it by crucifixion. And the process of crucifixion put a tremendous strain on the wrists and the arms and the shoulders, so that they became dislocated, and the shoulders and the elbow joints got pulled out of joint. And when they tied him to a post lying down, and when they raised it up, then the hips were jerked out of joint and the heels would have banged on the plate across the bottom. So it was a pretty unpleasant experience. We're going to look at Psalm 22, one of the key messianic passages. And as I said, it's written 400 years before the crucifixion was even invented. Can you all look at Psalm 22, please, because we're going to go through it verse by well, not quite verse by verse, but nearly. So in verse 1, we have Jesus' cry from the cross, which is fulfilled and recorded in Matthew 27, verse 46. It speaks of judgment, it speaks of separation from God, and it's the only time that Jesus called his Father God, not Father. So it shows that his relationship with the Father had been separated because of sin. In verses 6 to 8, we read that he was despised and mocked. Remember how they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they put a reed in his hand and they put the crown of thorns on his head, and they mocked him. And if he is the King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now, if he will have him. For he said, "I am the Son of God." So they were mocking Jesus, and that had been recorded in Psalm 22. And then by the thieves that crucified him, they mocked him too. The thieves that were crucified with him, they mocked him too. In verses 12 to 13, we read that the bulls of Bashan surround him. Now, that part of the country up near the Golan Heights was known for raising cattle. But I don't think Jesus was saying that the cattle from the Golan Heights were surrounding him down in Jerusalem. I think it was a reference to the demonic spirits, because that was an area where the Nephilim, the giants, had lived. So it was more likely to be the demonic spirits that were surrounding him at that point, which would have given him great oppression. Then we come to verse 14. All his bones were out of joint. That was indicative of crucifixion. And I don't know what you think about the Turin shroud. There are quite a lot of teachers, students that accept that as being genuine. I don't know whether it is or not, but it seems fairly obvious that it was a victim of crucifixion, and in that the arms are 9 inches longer than they should be, which indicates that the arms had been pulled out of their sockets and the joints of the elbow had been pulled out and they'd been stretched. The heart actually breaks during crucifixion, and Jesus said, "My heart is like wax, it's melted." Then he talks about having a dry mouth, and that is referred to in Matthew 27, verse 48. And John, when he describes it in John 19:28, said, "I thirst." John said that was a scripture that was fulfilled, and he was referring to this psalm. And then in verse 16, "They pierced my hands and my feet." Remember, Thomas asked to see the nail marks in his hands and his feet. He says, "I can count all my bones," and that's a sign of crucifixion. They cast lots for his garment, and Matthew draws attention to the fact that that was prophesied. Now we'll go on to another remarkable prophecy, the other most well-known messianic prophecy, which is Isaiah 53. So if you'd like to look that one up. What we have here is not just a description of what occurred, but of why it occurred. You can see that in verse 4, it talks about he bore our griefs and carried our sorrows. And in verse 5, he was wounded for our transgressions. In verse 8, he was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of others. And in verse 10, he was an offering for sin. Verse 12, he bore the sins of many. So in all that, it explains exactly why Jesus was being crucified. In verse 2, we read that his visage was marred. And that is quoted in Isaiah 50, verse 6. It talks about how they plucked out his beard. And again, this Turin shroud, over 70 scalp wounds are found on it. His visage was marred. says that we wouldn't want to look upon him. He was despised and forsaken. That's recorded in Matthew 27:39. He bore our griefs, which could be interpreted as disease, and he carried our sorrows, the mental anguish and pain. He was smitten of God and afflicted. He was pierced and scourged, wounded for our transgressions. Transgressions usually refers to wickedness and iniquities to rebellion. He didn't open his mouth before his accusers. He was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of others. He was killed with the wicked. Remember, two thieves were crucified with him. He was buried with the rich. Joseph of Arimathea was a very rich man, and he took the body and buried it in his tomb. There's a lovely joke which I hear, which somebody said to Joseph of Arimathea, well, I think maybe his wife said to Joseph of Arimathea, well, why did you put this body in our tomb? And Joseph says, oy vey, it's only for the weekend. This chapter 53 is remarkable in many ways. We've looked at how it's been precisely interpreted, but there is a hidden code in it, which there are hidden codes in a lot of the Bible, a lot of the Old Testament, but this one has a tremendous amount of information hidden in it. So we're going to look at this thing, the equidistant letter sequences. And in the 13th century, there was a Spanish rabbi who discovered that by skipping certain letters, he could pick out letters and read a code in it. Centuries later, in the 19th century, there was another rabbi who had acquired the commentary from this Spanish rabbi. And this was Rabbi Michael ben Weismandel. And at the age of 13, he got this commentary, and it sparked his interest, and he started studying. And he discovered a whole lot more codes in it. And it was published after his death in 1957. But I think probably not a lot of notice was taken of it. But I'm sure you're all aware of the Bible codes that was published by Michael Drosnin in 1997. The difference is, of course, that in about 1985 they had computers, and so they were able to test what was found. It must have been a really laborious business counting these letters and marking them off, and then perhaps finding that there's nothing, and then starting with another one and counting them. Tremendously laborious. But when you've got a computer to find them for you, then they could test the work that was already done, and they could find a whole lot more. It's interesting, actually, that Isaac Newton always said that there were codes hidden in the Bible. He was probably the first one to identify that. So we're going to have a look at one. So you've got your extra piece of paper. Obviously, it has to be in Hebrew. And Hebrew is normally written from right to left, but in this particular case, the code seems to go from left to right. And if you start at the bottom, okay, so you start with that one, you then count 20 letters, so you go along there and along here till you come to that one. And that's the sh sound, so you've got yush. You then count another 20 letters, and you come to u. So you've got y, sh, u, a, sh, m, e. Yeshua Shmi, which means Yeshua is my name. Also in this, there are a remarkable number of other words that are found. Messiah, Moriah, Peshach, Passover, cross, pierce, atonement lamb, and the names of all the disciples except Judas, and a whole lot more things as well. Things which can't possibly be there by accident. But God says that it's the duty of believers to search out a thing. It's the glory of kings, it's glory of God to hide something, and the duty of kings to search it out. And we're kings, aren't we? Kings and priests. So we can do a bit of searching out. So this is all quite amazing, I find it, that Yeshua Shmi, Yeshua is my name, is hidden in the text. And it's unique to this passage. It doesn't come anywhere else in the Bible. And you think of the Ethiopian eunuch asking, who is this about? What's this passage about? Does he speak of himself or somebody else? And hidden in the text is, Yeshua is my name. In Isaiah 7 verse 14, the Hebrew word for a virgin is Alma. Remember, a virgin will conceive and bear a child. And counting from the M of Alma, 17 letters, 3 times over from right to left, it spells Mashiach, Messiah. If you go on, counting from right to left, you haven't got that in your notes, 3 times, the 17th letter, you get Kavan, which is something similar to a sacrificial wafer. So what it is saying there is, Messiah is the sacrifice. In Psalm 22, the one we've just been looking at, verses 14 to 19, if you take every 45th letter, you get Yeshua Mashiach. Though I've just listed a whole lot of other things that are fulfilled exactly. Betrayed by a friend, actually the friend who ate his bread. David spoke of an incident in his life, but it was also prophetic. And we know that prophecy very often applies at the time and it applies to a future event. You've got a double prophecy. I'm not going to go through all of these 28. I'm going to pick out some particular ones. We read that he was sold for 30 pieces of silver in Zechariah, and that was the price of a slave. And we know that from Exodus 21, verse 32. We know too that the money was going to be thrown down in God's house, and it was the price was going to be given for a potter's field. When Judas took the money back and tried to say, I've done a terrible thing, I don't want to take this money, it's blood money, and he tried to give it back to the temple officials, and they refused to have it. So he flung it down in the temple. But they couldn't use it in the temple treasury because it was blood money. So they discussed what they should do with it, and they were obliged to bury any travelers that came and died in Jerusalem. They were obliged to bury them. So they had to have a place to bury them, so they thought, well, we'll buy the potter's field and we can bury them there. So that was fulfilled precisely, even though it might seem a bit bizarre. He was crucified with thieves. His crucifixion was considered a curse, and anyone who was executed in that way was considered cursed by God. Deuteronomy 21, verse 23 says, "For he is cursed of God who hangs on a tree." And in Galatians 3:13, we read that Christ became accursed for us. His bones weren't broken. In Exodus 12, verse 45, we can read that the Passover lamb can't have any bones broken. When people were crucified, because it was a holy day the next day, they couldn't leave them on the cross. Sometimes people took up to a week to die on the cross, even in all that heat. So they had to make sure that they died so that they could take them down from the cross. And they went to the first thief and broke his legs, which would mean he couldn't push himself up to breathe. And so he would die very quickly. And then they came to Jesus and they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. So it was he was a perfect sacrifice, a sacrificial lamb, Passover lamb. we read that there's darkness over the land. This is number 60. A lot of people thought that it was just that it was just a what do you call it? Eclipse. Yes, thank you. There are 3 quotes about the darkness at the time of the crucifixion, and the point is that it was dark from noon until 3 p.m, from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. So it's middle of the day. The church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, referred to it, and he referred to the 2nd century chronicler, a Greek historian called Phlegon. And he said that during the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, which was AD 32-33, a great eclipse of the sun occurred at the 6th hour, and it excelled everything that had ever gone before it. It turned the day into such darkness of night that the stars could be seen in heaven. And the earth moved, and it actually toppled many of the buildings in the city of Nicaea. So there was a record of the rather remarkable darkness, but he assumed it was an eclipse. Tertullian tells the story of the darkness that had commenced at noon during the crucifixion. And those who were unaware of the prediction says, no doubt they thought it was an eclipse. Tertullian was a North African historian. It couldn't have been an eclipse because the solar eclipses can't occur in the middle of the month. They can only occur when the moon is full. And on the 14th of Nisan, which was when the crucifixion took place, it was a new moon. Sorry, the other way around. It was a full moon, and it can't occur on a full moon. Solar eclipses are too brief to account for the crucifixion darkness. The maximum time that a solar eclipse has lasted is about 7 minutes, just over 7 minutes. This lasted for 3 hours. So it couldn't possibly have been a solar eclipse. It was a supernatural darkness. We look at some events that happened after his burial. His resurrection, his ascension, and seated at the right hand of God were all prophesied. And of course, you remember that Jesus himself prophesied that the sign of Jonah would show that he would be in the belly of, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so he would be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Again, the disciples didn't remember that until afterwards. Sometimes people raise objections about the validity of prophecies. One common one is that they were written retrospectively. Often they say that about Daniel. They think that his prophecies were so precise that he couldn't possibly have written them beforehand, and therefore he must have written them subsequently. But it wasn't Daniel that wrote them, of course, it was God. The other thing that is levelled against them sometimes is that Jesus deliberately fulfilled the prophecies. But you can't arrange where you're going to be born, and nor can you arrange where you're going to be buried. And you can't arrange that people are going to cast lots for your garments. There are a whole lot of things that were impossible for anyone to deliberately fulfill, beyond his control. Even thinking about the star over the manger at Bethlehem, over the house, at Bethlehem. Not possible for somebody on earth to arrange where a star is. Jesus upbraids the Pharisees for not being able to interpret the signs. So if we know that all the prophecies of the Old Testament concerning his birth and ministry and death were so accurately fulfilled, doesn't that mean that we should study the remaining prophecies that are left to be fulfilled? They're there for a purpose. They're there so that we know what's going to happen. And in fact, there are 8 times as many prophecies of Jesus' second coming than there are of his first coming. And obviously, it doesn't fit the brief that we're looking at, that the prophecies in the Old Testament that Jesus has fulfilled, but I think it's relevant that we look at them because there are so many of them. In the first time, he came as a prophet and a priest. He's now a priest in heaven interceding for us. And in his second coming, he will be a king. Obviously, it's not fulfilled yet, but there's plenty of information about what will happen at his second coming. It talks about two separate occasions. The first time is that he will come in the air unexpectedly and like a thief in the night, and at the sound of the last trumpet. And he will come to catch away the believers, and this is generally known as the rapture or the harpazo. And the word harpazo is like a bird of prey snatching his prey and flying off with it. It happens very, very suddenly. And that's what we're expecting, that Jesus will come to gather us together, snatch us away unexpectedly to the rest of the world. There are various opinions as to when it's going to happen, and I'm not going to go into that just yet. He'll come back in the air unexpectedly, except to those who are watching for him, and he will catch away the believers, and it will be at the sound of the last trumpet. In contrast to that, there is a time when he will come back to earth as opposed to in the air. Every eye will see him. That's not going to be unexpected, is it? And all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and it will be at the sound of the great trumpet. And when we look at the feasts later, you'll see that the great trumpet is a different time from the last trumpet. So these haven't been yet fulfilled, so we can't look at them in Old Testament prophecy as fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Also, there's a point that all the prophecies about the rapture are in the New Testament. That makes sense because the rapture is for the church, and the church hadn't been formed until we came to the New Testament. So that's when it's going to happen. Right, I've simplified this as much as I can. There's a time leading up to the last days, which are called the birth pangs. And you know the signs that were given in Matthew 24 and some of them in Luke 21 and Mark 13. Things about earthquakes and diseases and plagues and fear spreading out over the earth, and men's hearts failing them for fear. Lots of signs which are called birth pangs. Then that leads into a time called the 7-year tribulation. And at the halfway stage of that, the Antichrist will be revealed. At the end of that 7-year tribulation, the last bit of it, which is called the wrath of God, then the Lord will return. And the day of the Lord is a very common phrase in Old Testament prophecy. And it's not always clear when the day of the Lord is being referred to. But if you read most of the prophecies, they're talking about it as a day of destruction, a day of gloom, a day of terror. So it could apply to the wrath of God, the last 3.5 years, or it could begin with the Lord's return coming back when he judges the nations. Many people believe that it's just the day of the Lord's return, and many think that it carries on through the millennial reign, because when Jesus comes back, he will reign for 1,000 years, and that is something worth waiting for. So that is going to be a wonderful time. You possibly will come across people who don't believe that the millennial reign is still to come. They're called amillennialists, and they believe that we're already in it. I think that the fact that we read that during that millennial reign Satan will be bound is a pretty clear indication that we're not in it now. We'll look at some of the prophecies that are prophesied in the Old and New Testament about the return of Jesus. We know that all the nations will gather to fight against Jerusalem, and then the Lord will come and fight against these nations. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, we're told. The Mount of Olives will split in two and move apart, and there will be a great gulf. There will be no light. There will be signs in the skies. There will be great darkness. He will be coming in the clouds with great glory. He'll return with his saints. So we must have gone up first for him to return with us at that time. So the rapture must come either at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation or in the middle. He will slay the Antichrist by the breath of his mouth and the brightness of his coming. And the Jews will recognize him as their Messiah, and they will mourn for the one that they pierced. There's a lot about the day of the Lord. It may begin in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. It may continue to the end of the millennial reign, because Jesus is reigning throughout that time, so it's all the day of the Lord. It includes the return of Jesus and the Battle of Armageddon, and it ends with the great white throne judgment where the unsaved are judged. It's described as a day of wrath, destruction, darkness and clouds, very terrible. Sun and moon become dark and the heavens are shaken. There's one thing that I find quite interesting, and that is in Zephaniah 2 verse 3, it refers to a time when people are hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. And I believe that is when we are hidden for that period of time during the marriage of the Lamb, 7-year period, equivalent to the 7-day period of a marriage. That is also indicated in Isaiah 26 verses 20 and 21. Malachi 4 verse 5 refers to Elijah coming first. So possibly he's one of the two witnesses. In fact, probably he's one of the two witnesses that are prophesying and preaching during the 42 months of that tribulation. And then there's the millennial reign. The Lord will be king over all the earth. Everyone will recognize that he is king. All the nations will gather together in Jerusalem to see God's glory. They will go up once a year for the Feast of Tabernacles in order for there to be rain on their land. It's an everlasting kingdom given to the Son of Man by God. The fierce animals will be tamed in that time, and Israel will dwell safely. It's a reign of justice and righteousness, and he will reign from Mount Zion. And as I said, Satan will be bound, which makes it a wonderful time. So lots to look forward to, lots to look out for, to keep our eyes open for that time when he's coming back. But because we know that everything has been fulfilled so exactly, then we know that all the prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled will be fulfilled precisely, exactly, amazingly. So we do need to study them to know that.